Fellow, the city smells of wet stone and crushed herbs, and the Arno moves like a pale ribbon through a town that, until this year, thought itself invulnerable. You wake before dawn to the chiming of parish bells and the distant clang of a guild bell. You smell vinegar on a neighbor's handkerchief and see smoke where someone has burned linen. You know, because everyone knows, that this is the spring of 1348. That rumor has a name now. The pestilence from the east. You do not need a banner or a proclamation. The streets speak it. Shops shuttered, courtiers gone quiet, carts bearing bundles of the dead. Listen to the same city in third person then. Florence in 1348 was a merchant republic whose wealth ringed the riverbanks. Dyehouses and looms, money changers under arcades, parish confraternities gathering in painted chapels. Guilds regulated work, workshops smelled of oil, wool, and boiled dye stuff. The city's rhythm, bells, barter, the scuff of sandals, was a choreography learned over generations. Into that choreography, the plague stepped like a new instrument, discordant and unforgiving. The first effects were practical and immediate. Merchants found their apprentices absent. A wool worker who once kept 4 looms now tends 2. Confraternities attempted rituals, masses, processions, vows to saints. Many Florentines looked to clergy and physicians for explanations. Learned men wrote treatises. Their remedies ranged from aromatic mixtures and fumigations to exhortations of penitence. Yet these responses, earnest as they were, collided with a reality they could not command. Death could arrive in a house overnight. Boccaccio's later described what contemporaries saw. His Decameron, composed a few years after the catastrophe and shaped by memory as much as observation, places Florentines fleeing into the countryside, sealing city gates, and improvising care for their kin. Giovanni Villani, the chronicler, recorded the abruptness of collapse and, hauntingly, became one of its many casualties. His death is a documented marker of how even those who preserved the city's story did not escape. Senses anchor this history. Imagine a workshop where a dyer leans close to a vat of indigo, hands stained blue, breath thick from steam, and at his feet, silence where a boy should be stamping wool. Outside, market stalls once loud with hawkers lie half-covered. A cart creaks by, its driver wearing a coarse scarf, carrying a pallet of unclaimed clothes that smell faintly of vinegar. In houses, families hang rosemary and juniper from beams and keep hearths low to ward off the miasmas believed to ride the air. Medical thought in Florence mixed learned Arab and Latin traditions with local practice. Physicians and barber surgeons tried bloodletting, poultices, and fumigations of aromatic smoke. Some recommended isolation, though systematic municipal quarantines as practiced later were not yet fully developed in many cities. The result was heartbreaking. Some houses became sealed prisons, others emptied entirely. Neighbors knocked and then fled. Midwives continued to work, bringing children into a world that had suddenly lost elders and neighbors. Death did not announce itself with a single face. Some sickened quickly with swollen lymph nodes, buboes, that blackened and oozed, others with fever and coughing that shredded strength over days. Burials multiplied, churches and parish cemeteries strained. Mass pits were cut into fields outside the walls. Boccaccio's pages, though literary, confirm the logistics. Carts, hurried graves, relatives unable to perform customary laments. The city, which had long measured time by holy days and the guild calendar, found its rituals overwhelmed. Economy and care were braided together. The textile economy suffered immediate blows. Looms stood idle, contracts went unpaid, and credit tightened. But this is not only a ledger story. Relationships ruptured and reconfigured. Servants vanished. Guilds felt the absence of masters and journeymen alike. Houses that survived found their owners transformed, cautious, sometimes more generous in giving alms, sometimes stoically resigned. And the social map of Florence would be redrawn in the years after, because demographic and economic shifts follow calamity. Importantly, not everything about this time is certain. Contemporary numbers are unreliable. Estimates of mortality in Florence vary among historians. Some sources and later scholars suggest the city lost perhaps half its population. Others propose lower figures. What is certain, attested in multiple contemporary accounts, is the speed and breadth of disruption. Neighborhoods emptied, public life contracted, and a civic bewilderment took hold. Amid the suffering, survival often boiled down to ordinary decisions that felt both pragmatic and desperate. Fleeing to a hilltop villa might spare people for weeks. Closing shutters and avoiding market crowds could save a neighbor. Sometimes survival felt like mercy, sometimes like luck. Communal rituals, processions, vows, meals, alternated with private measures. The sick tended in cramped rooms, medicines and incense burned, letters written and left unread. Florence learned, painfully, that public cohesion could fray even as private acts of care multiplied. Tonight, as the Arno reflects lamp glows and the city holds its breath, a cart crosses the Ponte Vecchio with a bundle covered by rough cloth. A guild bell tolls for the dead. In the alleys, shutters close like lids. A family outside the walls debates whether to depart for the countryside. Their choice is one among many small acts that will shape who survives and who does not. What happens next will determine whether workshops vanish or adapt, whether confraternities rebuild social bonds, whether memory hardens into laws and customs, and whether chroniclers who remain can make sense of the silence left by those who are gone. You step deeper into Florence and the city's practical centers, workshops, marketplaces, hospital wards, where the plague rewrites ordinary routines. Morning in this Mercato Nuovo used to begin with the clack of carts and the bright syllables of traders selling leather, spices, and figs. Now the same stone square is quieter. A few stallholders spread their goods and watch the crowd with a new caution, keeping distance that would once have been unthinkable. A leather worker counts his coins with trembling fingers. A spice seller fans ground cinnamon and cloves as if the scent itself might be a shield. These small gestures are not superstition alone. The scent of aromatics is one of the few practices that offers people a sense of agency in a world that otherwise feels inexplicable. Guilds feel the shock in their bones. The Arte della Lana, which once organized cloth production across the city, finds looms idle and contracts unpaid. Masters summon journeymen where they can. Some journeymen flee to familial holdings in the contado. The Arte de Medici e Speziali, physicians and apothecaries, become vital nodes of practical knowledge. Apothecaries grind herbs, distill vinegars, and blend balsams. Physicians write notes recommending fumigation, clean bedding, and isolation where possible. Learned remedies, theriac, complex aromatic compounds, vinegar washes, circulate, but their effectiveness is uncertain and unevenly applied. Medicine and hope mingle in the same bowls. Hospitals and confraternities become the city's human instruments of care and burial. Santa Maria Nuova, founded in the 13th century and long run by a mix of civic donors and religious men and women, is a place where the wounded and the fevered arrive with equal urgency. The hospital's cloisters fill with the sound of low prayers and the wet slap of water used to wash linens more times than any year before. Nuns and lay brothers, guild volunteers, and hired attendants shoulder work that requires both tenderness and brute resilience, turning the fevered, changing bandages stained with sweat and darker things, lifting the dead into sheets. The smell here is a thin fog of wine, boiled herbs, vomit, and cedar. The air tastes of vinegar and the patient's breath. Outside institutional wards, brotherhoods like the Compagnia della Misericordia, accustomed to burying the poor and performing acts of mercy, are pressed into extraordinary service. They dig graves in fields beyond the walls, ferry bodies in rough carts, and recite brief prayers across pits where dozens are laid down in the same day. The ideal of individual, consecrated graves phrase, when pits become the only practical answer. Still, men and women of the confraternities labor to preserve a sliver of dignity, covering bodies, marking where they can, whispering psalms. For many families, customary rites, laments at a coffin, the washing of a corpse by kin, are impossible. Ritual compresses into small private acts or disappears altogether. Women are the invisible scaffolding of daily survival. Midwives continue to deliver babies in courtyards and bakehouses. Sometimes in the same week they tend a fevered neighbor. Household managers decide whether to keep a sick relative inside or send them away to an outlying villa. They ration bread, hide small valuables, and teach children to sweep without touching others. Much of this labor will leave faint traces in chronicles, yet it determines who lives and who dies. Servants who remain gain responsibilities. Widows who survive must navigate household economies suddenly stripped of stable income. In these cramped choices, the social shape of Florence shifts quietly. Labor roles blur, kinship networks tighten, and new household arrangements appear. Religion remains a lodestone and a lightning rod, Many Florentines seek comfort in confession, votive candles, and the ritual ordering of parish life. Extra-institutional movements also surge. Bands of penitents march through streets, scourging themselves, convinced that visible contrition might turn away divine wrath. Civic authorities, fearing the epidemiological consequence of mass gatherings, worry these processions will do more harm than good. Alongside piety, fear breeds suspicion. Whispers circulate about foreigners, itinerant merchants, and even neighbors who keep to themselves. In some places in Europe, suspicion hardens into violent scapegoating, and Florence is not immune to the corrosive glance of blame, even when evidence is lacking. Economy and trust strain together. Notaries record hasty property transactions and the sale of houses whose masters have died or fled. Debt goes unpaid, rent is deferred. At the same time, subtle signs of resilience appear. Some families pool stores of grain, guilds reorganize work around smaller teams, and local barter replaces formal credit when trust frays. Historians will later identify a long, consequential arc, labor shortages, shifting wages, altered landholding, that grows from these moments. But in the immediacy of 1348, outcomes are uncertain and contested. Recovery is not guaranteed, only possible. Within Palazzo Vecchio, the signoria meets more often. Councilors argue about city gates and the danger of closing them, about requisitioning rooms and ships for the sick, about whether to fund more graves or to levy aid. Every measure costs something. Shutting the city risks hunger, requisitioning houses displaces families, ordering processions risks more infection. These are, in effect, the same dilemmas that a widow on the Oltrarno or a silk dyer in Santo Spirito face at a smaller scale. Decisions where any benefit to public order can translate into private ruin. A widow pins rosemary to her doorframe and folds her husband's cloak into a chest. A confraternity messenger crosses the Ponte Vecchio with a list of names and a plea for more hands to dig graves. Inside the Signoria, debate hardens into intent. The coming decree and how people choose to obey or resist it will force choices that cannot be easily reversed. Dawn finds Florence quieter, but not inert. In the alleys near San Lorenzo, a notary opens his ledger and reads names that last week would have seemed unremarkable. Merchants, a dyer, the mistress of a small inn. Those names now appear in a different company. Wills, inventories, and short directives written in haste. Florence's notarial tradition, built over generations, functions as a moral infrastructure. A will is not only a transfer of goods, it is also a prayer and a practical map for those left behind. Across the city, the texture of daily life frays in ways both obvious and subtle. Children learn to step aside on the street. Guild workshops keep fewer apprentices near each master. A baker closes earlier not because of law, but because fear makes him cautious. The city's soundscape changes. Fewer haggling cries, fewer clinking coins. Inside households, the rituals that once ordered every day, waking prayers, small offerings to saints, the steady rhythm of sewing and mending, continue, but they are now threaded with calculation and contingency. Practical demands sharpen every interaction. When a physician arrives, he carries a kit of vinegar, distilled waters, and poultices of aromatic herbs wrapped in linen. He speaks the learned language of humors and miasmas, recommending fumigation, broths, and sometimes cupping. The remedies draw on Galen and Avicenna and are applied with great sincerity, yet their power against this pestilence is limited. The sick shiver under coarse blankets, while fevers rise and fall, and families keep vigil through nights scented with medicinal smoke and fear. Institutions strain to absorb the shock. Santa Maria Nuova and other hospitals extend routines into continuous care, transforming cloisters and guest rooms into infirmaries. Confraternities that once organized charity and devotional festivals become logistics managers of grief. They move bodies, prepare simple coffins, and recite psalms with a cadence sharpened by necessity. The Compagnia della Misericordia and similar associations dig graves beyond the city walls. Where parish yards cannot hold the dead, mass pits are cut into open fields to accommodate the tide of loss. Fear widens existing faults in social trust. Rumors find purchase where proof is scarce, and suspicion can harden into violence. Across Europe, some communities accused minorities of poisoning wells, and those accusations led to massacres in places such as Strasbourg. In Florence, the specifics differ, but anxiety is no less real. Tensions gather around the Jewish quarter, itinerant merchants, and anyone who keeps to themselves. Civic leaders sometimes work to restrain mob impulses and uphold law, but grief and rumor press hard at civic restraint. The economic picture is paradoxical and unsettling. Certain trades collapse, luxury workshops that produced velvet and gold thread fall silent as patrons die or flee, while other activities swell in immediate importance. Carpenters are hired to build coffins, distillers sell vinegar used for fumigation, and vendors of fuel and herbs supply the constant hearths. Labor shortages ripple through production. When a master dies and no journeyman is available to run a loom, cloth production slows and merchants find contracts unfulfilled. In the short term, many households face hardship and lost income. Over years, these ruptures will reshape labor relations and property arrangements. Amid the strain, acts of courage and ordinary tenderness keep the city breathing. A midwife stoops over an exhausted mother in a cramped chamber and guides a child into a world where grandparents may not be present. A guildmaster pays the debts of a deceased journeyman so his widow can keep a small house. Neighbors leave loaves and clean linens outside a shuttered door for families too afraid to admit sickness. These quiet economies of care are often invisible to chroniclers, yet they determine who survives in small, incremental ways. Religious life bends in public and private ways. Parish priests try to balance the need for sacraments with the practical necessity of reducing gatherings. Some services are shortened, and others moved outdoors. Penitential movements arise, sometimes private, sometimes visible, as people seek spiritual explanations and relief. For many Florentines, faith becomes both refuge and a guide. Votive offerings, prayers, and small communal rites provide psychological support, even as civic officials worry that processions and mass gatherings might spread contagion. Governance must translate compassion into policy. The Signoria debates whether to restrict markets, order quicker burials, or requisition rooms to house the afflicted. Each measure carries a cost. Closing bridges and gates may protect neighborhoods, but cut the flow of food and grain into the city. Ordering burials into common pits may preserve public safety, but wound families who expect individualized rights. Requisitioning houses forces difficult choices on households already stretched thin. Officials search for an equilibrium that preserves life without destroying the lifeblood of the Republic. Tonight, the councilors leave the Palazzo Vecchio with heavier steps than before. Messengers cross the Ponte Vecchio carrying lists of names and urgent pleas. Outside, a widow pins a sprig of rosemary to her door and listens for the tolling bell. Inside the council chamber, candles gutter low as debate turns toward a single pressing question. Which measures will Florence adopt at dawn, and how will ordinary people answer them in workshops, kitchens, and courts across the city and onward? You cross into the quieter quarters, and the city's mechanics come into focus. The notaries, the guild halls, the small shops that still try to keep business and care in one hand. Here, the plague rearranges ordinary loyalties and obligations into urgent arithmetic. Who will feed the apprentices? Who will mind the ledger? Who will claim a bench in the guild hall when masters die? A notary's room smells of wax and ink. Scrolls lie piled on a rough table. A candle sputters where a hand has stopped writing. Notaries are suddenly civic surgeons. They stitch legal continuity into the body of a city that is losing its limbs. Men and women come to have wills recorded at odd hours. A merchant who once argued contracts over wine now sits sober and precise, naming an executor, assigning a workshop, promising apprentices a final payment so they will not be cast out when his house closes forever. These acts are practical, but they are also acts of hope, bets that human systems can outlast mortality. The notarial bundles themselves will later help scholars trace the shape of loss. Which quarters emptied fastest? What goods were most widely bequeathed? Where credit unraveled first? Guild halls, where once the noise of looms and hammered metal made summer afternoons dense with industry, fall into an anxious hush. Masters call journeymen to the hall and negotiate. Who will keep the looms? Who will tend the dye vats? And what allowances can be made when a master's family must keep one hearth and abandon another? The Arte della Lana and the Arte dei Medici e Speciali find themselves acting as emergency administrators. A dye house that loses its dyer cannot send cloth to market. A money changer who falls ill leaves debts in limbo. The web of credit, the very circulatory system of Florence's prosperity, is strained, and every broken node forces neighbors to make decisions that will echo for years: to sell land, 2. Apprentice children out sooner than planned. 2. Accept marriages arranged not for sentiment but for household survival. Markets adapt with improvisation. Stallholders that remain spread wares more thinly, marking space between stands by instinct rather than law. A spice seller fans ground cinnamon to the breeze not only to sell, but to make the square smell less of illness. Bread ovens still glow at dawn, but their owners set aside loaves to be left anonymously at flagged doors. These small, often nameless economies of care, the hidden vouchers of trust and food left at a threshold, keep certain families alive through days when official charity is overwhelmed. Hospital wards, from Santa Maria Nuova's cloisters to humble infirmaries run by confraternities, become places where the practical and the moral meet. Nuns and lay brothers work long shifts, turning fevers, changing linens, and whispering prayers. They are expected to be both caregivers and clerks, counting not only pulses, but also who has claimed what pouch of herbs, what voucher for bread. The smell inside a hospital is a bitter, layered thing. Wine used for cleaning, boiled herbs, the metallic tang of blood, the sourness of sweat. Those who survive the work are marked by it. Their hands carry stains, and their voices hold an economy of small consolations, learned through repeated care. Religion and ritual reconfigure under strain. Parish priests try to reconcile the demand for sacraments with the need to limit gatherings. Some rituals migrate outdoors, brief blessings in courtyards, prayers from doorways, candles left at thresholds. Penitential processions still occur in some neighborhoods, but city leaders increasingly view them as dangerous. For many, the faith that has ordered daily life becomes both refuge and a contested space. Some souls find solace in public devotion, others find new practices at home, whispered prayers, private vows, small devotional gifts left for neighbors. The spiritual landscape becomes as varied as the social one. Criminal opportunity rises where oversight falls. When civic records slow and markets tighten, theft and fraud quietly increase. Families with few defenders may lose small trinkets or sums that, to an outsider, seem trivial, but in that household mean the difference between keeping a rented room and being thrown onto the street. Conversely, the crisis also provokes communal safeguards. Guilds formalize relief lists. Confraternities coordinate mass burials so that the dead receive at least a semblance of right, and wealthier citizens sometimes provide funds for food distributions. These acts of organization are not purely charitable. They are also pragmatic. A functioning populace is necessary for trade, grain deliveries, and the maintenance of law. The countryside's relationship with the city becomes complex and conditional. Some city families with land retreat to villas, hoping seclusion will protect them. Others, lacking such refuge, attempt to live by kinship networks outside the walls. But the transfer of people from urban to rural spaces spreads both goods and risks. Monasteries that once cared for the ill find themselves short of hands and overwhelmed by refugees. Local peasant households, used to cyclical scarcity, suddenly must stretch resources at odd times. In this way, the crisis ripples outward from Florence, altering labor patterns and market ties across the Contado. Within all of these big currents, small human choices decide fates. A midwife's knowledge of cooling compresses, the willingness of an apprentice to keep a loom turning, the decision of a neighbor to leave a pot of broth at a threshold without knocking. These are the practical acts that will multiply into survival. They are not heroic in a classical sense. They are ordinary, sustained, and often invisible. Yet, they create the social scaffolding on which the city will either be rebuilt or further fall apart. As night falls, merchants tally losses by lamplight, guildmasters count remaining hands, and the signoria's councilors prepare to meet again. A new draft ordinance circulates among their scribes. Restrictions on gatherings, guidance for market rotations, suggested protocols for households with the sick. It is not yet law, but it is a pressure in the same register as the cough in a neighbor's room. For a woman who sits awake holding a child and listening to a husband's labored breath, the signoria's next decree will matter not in abstract policy language, but in whether she chooses to stay and care or to risk a flight into the unknown. The city holds its breath, and small, urgent choices will multiply into history. The morning air is thin with ash and the sour tang of vinegar. Where the city once prized appearances, bright banners, polished leather, the precise sweep of a merchant's stall, practicality now determines optics. Shutters closed, windows stuffed with cloth, coins quietly dipped in vinegar and passed without conversation. Routine becomes ritualized care. Every small action is a hedge against uncertainty. In the parish of San Lorenzo, the priest's voice is hoarse from repeated absolutions. Clergy across Florence are stretched thin. Many of them have fallen sick. Fewer hands mean fewer last rites, and where a priest cannot come, layfolk improvise with whispered prayers and simple gestures. The absence of a priest shapes how people die. Some receive hurried sacraments at threshold. Others pass through a night of fever without the consolations they have known all their lives. The loss of clergy produces a new kind of grief, anxiety shaped by the absence of ritual more than by the absence of life. Funerary practice changes most palpably on the city's outskirts. Where family tombs and consecrated graves once marked neighborhood identity, mass burials become a grim necessity. Teams of men, sometimes drawn from confraternities and sometimes paid by civic purse, dig long pits beyond city walls. Bodies arrive on rough carts, wrapped in coarse cloths when possible. The ministrations that would once have accompanied burial, washing by kin, the slow chanting of psalms, the presence of mourners in close proximity, are compressed to brief prayers shouted across the wind or spoken by a single man who moves from one covered body to the next. The dignity of the dead is a hope more than a guarantee. This compression of ritual alters memory. Those who survive face a double absence: the personal face of the deceased and the public rituals that once gave meaning to death. People begin to mark graves in pragmatic ways: simple piles of stones, a hastily carved cross, the odd scrap of cloth. Over time, these pragmatic marks harden into landmark memory, but in the weeks of the plague, they are small acts of recognition in a world that otherwise refuses to pause. Markets and supply chains feel the pressure as well. Grain convoys bound for Florence creak under new burdens. Officials demand manifest lists, dealers quarantine sacks where possible, and traders haggle not over price alone, but over the risk of contamination. The city's bakers ration bread with lists drawn by guild clerks. You cannot simply buy a dozen loaves if your household's name is not on the register. Yet informal networks fill gaps. Neighbors leave pots of soup at thresholds, guildmasters authorize small relief stashes, and some charities, already stretched before the pestilence, stretch further still. These acts of redistribution are ad hoc, improvised responses that patch a civic fabric being worn thin. Labor shortages reshape the pace of work and, eventually, the rules of economy. Workshops that once depended on a chain of master, journeyman, and apprentice cannot always count on the same hands. Masters make blunt choices: accelerate apprenticeships, marry off adult daughters to secure households, or sell portions of property to pay debts. Notarial records swell with quick transfers and sudden bequests, a legal fog that historians will later use to map loss. In the immediate, however, survival drives decisions more than long-term strategy. Families trade continuity for immediate sustenance. A house is sold to buy food. An apprentice is sent to a relative in the contado to avoid exposure. A widow remarries sooner than custom would usually allow. This flux creates both peril and possibility. Without the usual workforce, wages in some trades rise. In others, production simply halts. The result is a patchwork economy where scarcity and sudden demand collide. Carpenters are hired to make coffins and mend shuttered doors. Apothecaries sell remedies at desperate prices. Distillers turn over vinegar jars to anyone who can pay. The city's fiscal heart strains. Tax receipts fall as merchants flee or die. The signoria must balance the desperate need for relief with the imperative to keep grain flowing and law enforced. Community enforcement becomes a daily negotiation. Urban neighbors form improvised watches to prevent theft. Guilds create lists of widows and orphans to receive relief. Confraternities attempt to safeguard rituals even as they manage logistics. Sometimes civic authorities impose measures: restricted market days, limits on gatherings, orders to use separate burial grounds. These measures are unevenly obeyed. For some, obedience is born of fear. For others, the temptation to skirt rules, for food, for shelter, for commerce, overrides civic edict. The friction between public safety and private necessity becomes one of the plague's fiercest moral tests. Everywhere, grief is askew. Some families can afford a small ceremony, a closed-door prayer, a handful of neighbors, a simple grave marker. Others lose relatives without even the chance to say farewell. The psychological strain is acute. The city feels as if it slumps under a common sorrow that yields no easy consolations. People who return from remote villas discover empty houses where life had once been humming. They are left to pick through furniture and chests, to confront the sudden absence of stories once told at meals. Memory becomes a private labor. A woman recites her husband's favorite prayers aloud each night. A child keeps a small wooden toy as a talisman against forgetting. Amid the unraveling, the señoria's debates intensify. Municipal clerks have drafted ordinances that range from pragmatic to draconian, regulations for the disposal of bodies, limits on gatherings, designated infirmaries, and proposals to requisition empty houses for the sick. Each proposal carries its own human cost. Requisition can shelter the afflicted but displace tenants. Strict burial rules may preserve public health but wound families. The councilors weigh these costs with a citizenry watching and waiting, their lives balanced on decisions written in ink. As the council prepares to make a decision, the city's thresholds fill with small dramas. A widow bargaining for the return of a chest of linen, a guildmaster pleading for a temporary reprieve from dues so his journeymen can eat, a pair of brothers clinging to the hope that the countryside they fled to will keep them safe. The señoria's choice will be read aloud at dawn, in piazzas and on bridgeheads. How people respond, whether they accept, flee, resist, or improvise, will shape who survives the next weeks and how Florence's social order rearranges itself in the months to come. Dusk brings a new cadence. The city that once hummed with business now organizes itself around triage, ritual, and calculation. In workshops, masters leave abbreviated instructions on doors. Wages for apprentice Matteo paid, loom to be tended by cousin. At thresholds, neighbors leave salted meat and loaves wrapped in cloth, the act as intimate as a prayer. The social ledger keeps updating in small entries, gifts, loans, promises, that will outlive eyewitness memory and later become the raw material for legal records and mourners' lists. Amid this arithmetic, ordinary gestures acquire a gravity they never had before. A basin of water set at a doorway, a length of linen hung to mark a closed hearth, a pair of shoes left outside for fear of carrying contagion indoors. In one vivid scene, a small courtyard off the Via Calzaiuoli becomes an unlikely hospital. A merchant's house, its master fled to a villa beyond the hills, opens to a handful of neighbors. A midwife arranges straw mattresses on the floor, an apothecary mixes a bitter poultice to cool fevers. A pair of teenagers is sent to fetch vinegar and rosemary. The courtyard smells of boiled herbs and the sharp, metallic tang of sweat. Under a lantern, hands move with focused economy. Cooling compresses applied to foreheads. Linen bandages replaced. A child handed a warmed spoon of broth. Conversation is minimal, names, instructions, a whispered recounting of recent deaths, but the small choreography of care holds the room together. When the merchant's wife convulses and goes suddenly still, the courtyard becomes a place of practical grief. Neighbors fold her into a sheet, a man ties a scrap of painted cloth to a stake so the family will remember the grave's location, and the street outside swallows the sound of subdued sobbing. Law and record-keeping respond in kind. Notaries copy hurriedly scrawled wills, while clerks tally the names of the missing. Registers fill with bequests of silver spoons and bolts of cloth, alongside requests to free apprentices for lack of food. These legal traces will later let scholars map the plague's uneven impact. Which guilds suffered most, which streets emptied fastest, how property reallocated. But for people in the moment, a notary's stamp is a small hope that kin will be provided for, a bureaucratic bulwark against the disorder of death. In cramped rooms, ink-stained hands make final arrangements. The workshop left to a trusted journeyman, a parcel of grain set aside for a widow, a godparent named for a newborn who may never see a grandfather again. At the same time, cultural life mutates. The small, improvised performances that livened guild feasts disappear. Illuminated workshops hum less. Yet the need to make meaning does not vanish. People compose prayers and short vernacular songs to sing in the streets. Artisans carve hastily trimmed crosses to mark makeshift graves. Boccaccio's later decision to frame the Decameron around 10 young people who flee the city and tell stories will be one literary response among many. An attempt to imagine life amid absence and to hold narrative against the yawning quiet left by the dead. Art does not stop. It bends inward, improvising with less material and less audience. Suspicion and blame twist in the shadows. Where proof is thin, rumor flourishes. Some point to outsiders, merchants from Genoa or Pisa, itinerant traders, peasants from the Contado, who arrive with baskets and stories. Others seek rationales in the humoral theories of physicians, an excess of black bile, a corrupt summer, poisoned airs. On the darker edge of fear, scapegoating takes root. Across Europe, accusations of well poisoning and violence against Jewish communities erupted in places such as Strasbourg. Florence feels the pressure of such anxieties even if its responses differ in degree and form. Civic leaders sometimes strive to restrain mob impulses, but grief is combustible and whispers travel quickly along alleys and over bridgeheads. Political decisions press on daily life. The Signoria debates whether to impose restrictions on innkeeping, market hours, and processions. Such ordinances, when issued, are unevenly enforced. Some neighborhoods comply and organize shift-based market days to reduce crowding. In others, the pull of commerce, the need to buy grain, to get coin for rent, overrides caution. Enforcement sometimes falls to guild-appointed watchmen who, with civic approval, patrol squares to keep distance between stalls or to mark times for specific trades. These ad hoc measures reveal a practical ethic: preserve trade enough to feed the city while limiting congregation enough to blunt transmission. The balance is fragile, and every arrangement favors some at the expense of others. The interplay of grief and economy produces hard moral choices. Wealthier families who retreat to villas must decide whether to abandon servants or pay them, whether to leave houses empty or to requisition them for the afflicted. Some masters write detailed directives and funds for those they leave behind. Others depart and sever ties. Servants who remain sometimes inherit household responsibilities but also exposure. Widows who survive must decide whether to keep a shop open, arrange a remarriage for practical support, or accept charity with the humiliation such dependence can bring. These are intimate restructurings of social life, choices made in kitchens and doorways that will reshape family structures and labor patterns. A striking human center emerges in the city's burial practices. As pits are filled beyond the walls, families attempt small acts of remembrance: a scrap of painted cloth tied to a stake, a bowl of water set beside a mound of dirt, a whispered name offered at dusk. Clergy and confraternities try to record who is buried where, but missing registers and hasty mass graves make precision impossible. Memory becomes partial, stitched together from fragments. A notated name here, a carved cross there, the recollection of a neighbor. For those who survive, this partiality will leave a long shadow. The absence of precise rites, of a priest's full blessing, of a family's prolonged lament, creates a grief that is simultaneously personal and civic. Night arrives with low, uneasy light. A lantern glints off the Arno. A bell tolls a slow, solitary note. In a small room, an apprentice grips the hand of his dying master, whispering a prayer because no priest is near. Outside, a cart trudges toward a mass pit where a man who yesterday paid a guild fine will be laid beside strangers. The city keeps functioning, but it keeps itself with hands that are raw, tired, and learning new ways to be neighborly. That question remains as dawn nears. Can Florence remake the routine's death has unstitched, and will guilds, confraternities, and the Signoria repair social bonds quickly enough to prevent further collapse? Dawn arrives with the city moved into a different register. Florence does not simply endure the immediate horror, it improvises a new social grammar. In alleys and arcades, people reassign tasks and rights: who tends a loom, who fetches water, who takes charge of a child's schooling when a parent is gone. These small reallocations of labor will ripple outward and shape the city's future. At the center of change is work. Looms that once required teams now ask a single master to do the work of many, and masters must make hard bargains: higher pay to keep skilled hands, the recruitment of strangers from the contado, or a temporary halt to production. Journeymen who survive find their skills in new demand and press for wages rather than the old system of deferred housing and food. Apprentices who would once have trained for years are taught more quickly to cover immediate needs. Guild rules, which once regulated entry and fixed prices, bend under pressure. Disputes in guild halls ask whether custom or survival will set the terms. Women's roles shift visibly and practically. Widows manage workshops and small businesses. Daughters run ledgers and negotiate deliveries. Household stewards run the complex logistics of fuel, food, and care. Midwives and experienced house hands become indispensable not only for births, but for steady tending of fevers and the management of convalescence. These shifts do not erase established hierarchies overnight, but they create arenas of practical authority where women exercise decisions that have public effect: who to hire, which debts to prioritize, whether to keep a servant on the payroll or pay him to leave. Money and credit move like blood under injury. Notaries record sudden wills, emergency sales, and delegated powers. Some creditors accept small mercy payments to prevent total ruin. Others press claims with legal precision to secure their standing. Money changers who die or flee leave accounts unsettled. Merchants abroad find correspondence interrupted and contracts in limbo. The civic treasury strains as tax revenues fall and expenditures for burials and relief rise. At the same time, neighbors invent informal credit, loaves left at thresholds on trust, grain advanced against later payments, practical economies that keep certain households alive, while formal contracts unravel. Faith remains central, but shifts from public display to private practice and organized charity. Priests who remain are pulled between sacramental duties and administrative tasks. Confraternities that once organized festivals become logistics hubs, funding coffins, coordinating burial teams, and keeping lists of orphans. Where full burial rites cannot be arranged, families improvise. A lamp set at a window, a rosary tied to a post, the recitation of the same prayer at dusk to hold memory together. Religion continues to order life, but it threads itself into domestic space more often than into processional streets. Municipal governance learns as it acts. The signoria and its clerks draft ordinances to stagger market days, designate burial grounds beyond crowded parish yards, and recommend separate lodging for the sick. Implementation is uneven. Wealthier citizens can retreat to villas and comply. Poorer families remain tethered to markets for daily bread. Still, simple measures, segregating the sick, removing corpses from dense quarters, fumigating rooms with aromatic smoke, reduce immediate danger when enforced in combination. The city, in its imperfect way, begins to develop practices that temper contagion without destroying commerce. Culture contracts and adapts. Grand civic commissions slow as patrons die or flee, but quieter forms of devotion and craft persist. Artisans produce modest devotional objects, simple reliquaries, and painted panels for private chapels. Chroniclers and storytellers compress hours of grief into narrative and song. Households that once hosted feasts now gather small groups to remember the dead and to tell stories that keep names alive. These private cultural acts will later feed public art and literature that tries to make sense of the calamity. Tension and blame remain combustible. Where evidence fails, rumor finds purchase. Talk of poisoned wells, of foreign sailors, of corrupted air. In many parts of Europe, such suspicions have erupted into violence. Here, too, anxiety presses at the city's seams. Civic officials devote energy to preventing mob action and shielding vulnerable residents when they can, aware that durable recovery depends in part on maintaining law and trust. How leaders frame the crisis, charity and protection, or moral explanation and punishment, will shape whether grief hardens into communal solidarity or scorched exclusion. Economically, Florence enters a period of uneven transition rather than simple collapse. Some trades rebound quickly because demand persists: bakers and carpenters, coopers and candle makers, while luxury producers tied to ceremonial display contract for longer. Land is sometimes sold to cover debts. Merchants renegotiate credit and shipping across the Mediterranean. Guilds alter apprenticeship terms to admit urgently needed hands. The plague accelerates latent changes. Labor mobility increases. Wages in many sectors rise, and social arrangements long taken for granted become negotiable. Night falls and Florence practices its new rituals. Shutters tied against wind, lanterns conserved to save wax, small altars lit behind curtained windows. A clerk at the Palazzo Vecchio copies a list of orphans and petitions for relief. A widow trades a silver spoon for a sack of grain. An apprentice secures a master's loom by promising steady labor. These modest acts stitch a fragile social fabric. Outside the walls, those who fled to hillside villas watch smoke over the Arno and wonder whether distance will shelter them or simply postpone the reckoning. Movement between town and contado, food, goods, messages, and sometimes people will soon test every improvised solution Florence has made in these first brutal months. Soon, choices made in the Palazzo Vecchio and the movement of people between city and contado will decide whether Florence contains the disease or watches it spread further. Dawn arrives, and Florence moves into a new register. Absence becomes administrative work. The city's response is made of small legal and practical gestures that reroute social life. Apprenticeship contracts are rewritten at notaries' tables. Guild statutes are amended in emergency sessions to allow quicker admission and temporary wage changes. Parish rolls are expanded to include orphans and households in need. What looks bureaucratic on paper has material consequence in practice. Who can keep a hearth? Who will inherit a workshop? Who will feed a child when the father is gone? You feel this transformation in ordinary places. The marketplace smells less of festival incense and more of hearth, coal smoke, boiled herbs, and the sharp vinegar used for fumigation. Apprentices move faster, trained to repair warp threads and tend dye vats with an urgency that compresses years of learning into weeks. Masters give shorter, more transactional instructions because ledgers and survival leave little room for sentiment. Shops shorten hours to conserve lamp oil. Lists pinned to tavern doors announce households owed relief. The city's rhythm is measured now by inventories and by the slow recalculation of obligations. The economic map becomes jagged and uneven. Certain trades rebound quickly because survival demands them. Carpenters for coffins and shutter repairs, bakers for daily bread, coopers for storage of grain and oil. Luxury workshops that relied on ceremonial display and patronage fall silent for longer. The most consequential shift is in labor power. When mortality shrinks the pool of available hands, scarcity raises wages for many skilled laborers. Journeymen who once expected deferred compensation press for immediate pay. Apprentices are taught accelerated skills to keep looms running. These changes alter household decisions. Families weigh whether to retain servants, marry earlier for economic alliances, or sell a parcel of land to buy grain. Legal practice bends to social pressure. Hastily written wills become durable transfers. Notaries record co-ownership agreements and delegated household management. Simple inventories of textiles, jars, and implements compile into archives that map which neighborhoods emptied first and which goods changed hands. Those mundane records will later allow chroniclers and historians to trace how assets reallocated and which families consolidated holdings when older authorities died or fled. Religion and charity reorient their rhythms. With processions curtailed and clergy numbers diminished, devotional life moves indoors. Private altars, small painted panels, and curtained windows proliferate. Confraternities reallocate funds from festivals to practical relief. Bread distributions, stipends for midwives, and money for simple coffins. Patrons who once sought public piety so underwrite pragmatic charity, firewood for the needy, lists of households to be visited, and payments to men who dig graves. The moral economy shifts from display toward survival. Spirituality remains central, but it is expressed more in bread and blankets than in public spectacle. Civic authority learns by iterating measures. The signoria, normally preoccupied with trade, diplomacy, and ceremonial order, becomes a municipal public health office on the fly. Councilors authorize staggered market days to reduce crowding, designate burial grounds beyond crowded parish yards, and permit temporary requisition of empty houses as infirmaries. Enforcement is uneven. Wealthier households retreat to villas and comply more easily, while poorer families must still queue for grain and sometimes resist measures that threaten their daily subsistence. Nevertheless, some policy combinations prove effective. Removing corpses from dense quarters, supervising market rotations, and combining charity with enforcement reduce immediate danger when implemented together. Culture contracts and adapts rather than vanishes. Grand civic commissions slow as patrons die or flee, yet private artistic production continues in smaller domestic forms. Painters work on intimate panels for home chapels. Artisans carve simple markers for roadside graves. Storytellers stitch laments and new proverbs into local memory. Boccaccio's Decameron will later emerge as a famous literary response. But innumerable household laments, ballads, and prayers circulate in kitchens and yards. Oral codices that keep names alive and help communities narrate their losses. Danger nonetheless persists at the margins. Rumor and blame can harden into violence where municipal authority is thin. Across Europe, accusations of well poisoning and attacks on itinerant groups have precipitated massacres. Florence feels the pressure of similar anxieties. The signoria and guild leaders expend considerable effort preventing mob action and protecting vulnerable neighbors, aware that long-term recovery depends as much on law and trust as on grain and artisans. Charity, guild regulation, and confraternal networks act as social glue, but they are strained and frayed. Small domestic choices now map onto larger social shifts. A widow who runs a dye house must decide whether to expand production of simple burial cloths to meet new demand, or to sell the hearth and buy grain for winter. A guildmaster considers altering apprenticeship terms to admit more hands. A notary records a modest property transfer that will determine a family's prospects for generations. These intimate, pragmatic choices are the levers of historical change. Who gains property, how labor markets realign, which households survive, and which disappear. As dusk falls, petitions pile at the Palazzo Vecchio. Councilors read pleas demanding fixed prices for grain, protection against rent seizures, and funding for burial teams. Scribes copy hasty bequests and lists of orphans. The next morning, the guild hall will host a tense meeting. Journeymen pressing for higher wages, masters arguing for financial restraint. The outcome will test whether Florence's improvised bargains during catastrophe solidify into institutional reform, or whether old hierarchies reassert themselves once the immediate crisis dulls. A bell tolls from a convent and lantern smoke threads the Arno. The city braces for a vote that will shape not only wages and grain distribution, but the very terms of survival for families across its quarters. Inked ordinances and the stubborn choices of guilds and households may soon decide whether Florence returns to its old order or enters a new chapter shaped by absence, adaptation, and the patient labor of those left to rebuild. Dawn slides over tiles glassed with thin frost, and Florence wakes into consequences that will not simply evaporate when the fever breaks. The city's texture, its work, its worship, its wealth, now recalibrates around absence. What once felt like an emergency begins to ossify into new habit. Who inherits a workshop? How guild halls enroll desperate hands? Which streets empty first, and which refill with new faces? The immediate arithmetic is brutal and mundane. When a master dyer or wool merchant dies, the loom does not mourn. It stands idle until a living pair of hands claims it. Journeymen who survive find themselves bargaining in daylight instead of waiting years for favor. Apprentices are pushed into adult labor. Widows who suddenly run shops learn to read invoices and to bargain with grain merchants. Notaries glue these changes into permanence. Quick sales, emergency bequests, guardianships for children whose fathers never returned. Those inked acts will endure in vaults and will let later historians trace which neighborhoods contracted and which households consolidated. But ink cannot record the texture of a weaver's hands learning new knots at midnight, or a widow's sleepless arithmetic as she counts rations. Labor scarcity creates new pressure on custom. Guild statutes, a web of price fixing, apprenticeship rules, and ceremonial obligations, bend in ways that used to be unthinkable. Some guilds permit accelerated apprenticeships, others accept outsiders from the contado to refill depleted workshops. The arte della lana will reopen looms with a different cast of hands. The masters who survive must choose between clinging to old discipline and tolerating improvisation to keep trade alive. Those choices matter. When wages creep higher in some trades because skilled hands are rare, household calculations shift. Marriage ages change, dowries are renegotiated, and servants may find leverage they never had before. The social grammar of dependence loosens in small increments, and those increments accumulate. Religion, too, reshapes itself. Confraternities that once funded pageants and charity now reallocate funds to bread distribution and burial teams. Private devotion moves from piazzas to parlors. Families light lamps at curtained windows, commission small panels for home altars, and rehearse prayers that will preserve the names of the dead. Pilgrimage declines because travel risks more contagion. Instead, devotional life is domesticated. Clergy who remain are pulled toward administration, writing lists of orphans and widows, organizing relief, negotiating with guilds for labor to dig graves. Faith becomes not merely consolation, but municipal infrastructure. Artistic life narrows its frame but does not vanish. Grand civic commissions slow as patrons die or flee. Yet private painting, small-scale woodwork, and devotional crafts continue. Artists and scribes who survive find new patrons among families that inherit wealth. Literature absorbs trauma. Storytellers fold recent losses into tales told in closed parlors, and the Decameron, Boccaccio's later imagining of storytelling as solace, will become the most famous literary echo of those weeks. But countless anonymous laments and songs circulate in kitchens and doorways, oral stitches that help households grieve without a priest's full ceremony. Politics becomes the work of triage. The Signoria learns to draft ordinances that combine public health with economic pragmatism. Staggered market days, designated burial tracts, and temporary requisition of empty houses as infirmaries. Enforcement is inconsistent because law meets lived necessity. Grain must flow, and merchants press for enough commerce to feed the city. Poor families press for exceptions when the market hour conflicts with their only chance to buy bread. Counselors oscillate between coercion and charity, balancing the danger of contagion against the immediate risk of starvation. Their choices will reverberate through generations: who gains protections, who loses property, which guilds recover faster. Suspicion and blame do not disappear, they migrate and sometimes harden. Where evidence is thin, rumor finds purchase. Talk of well poisoning, of itinerant traders, of foreign sailors. In some Italian cities, these anxieties explode into violence. In Florence, they take subtler forms: social exclusion, economic blacklisting, and the tightening of neighborhood ties to insulate against outsiders. Such social seaming helps some survive and pushes others into precarious margins. The countryside complicates the story. Wealthier urban refugees retreat to villas and hill settlements, importing not only goods but also the practical challenges of feeding and staffing households. Small rural communities, unaccustomed to sudden influxes, stretch stores and labor. Monasteries and rural hospices, already centers of care, find themselves overwhelmed. Movement across the contado, of grain, of people, of rumor, links city and countryside in new, vulnerable ways. The Black Death's shock is not merely urban, it is territorial, bending the networks that knit Florence to its hinterland. Economically, the plague accelerates shifts that had been simmering. Labor mobility increases, wages rise unevenly, household economies fragment and recombine. Not all change is immediate uplift. Some households collapse, their assets dispersed in fire sale auctions. Others consolidate property and influence. Over the next decades, these redistributions will help produce social tensions, articulated later in labor uprisings such as the Ciampi Revolt. Yet, in the first months after catastrophe, the logic is private survival. Feed the children, keep the roof, preserve a name on a ledger, and then there is memory itself, a fragile civic fabric under strain. Mass graves, hastily marked, missing registers, a child left with a single faded toy. These are the archives of absence. Families invent liturgies of remembrance in parlors and workrooms, a daily recitation, a sewn emblem pinned to a lapel, the ritual of sweeping a courtyard on a particular saint's day. These small acts are private truth-making. Over time, they will become the sources for communal mourning, for commissioned paintings, for chronicles. But in the immediate weeks and months, they are what remain when public ritual cannot meet public need. As dusk falls, Florence's pulse is a series of small, stubborn acts. A guildmaster training an apprentice by lamplight, a notary sealing a quick will, sisters whispering a prayer over a shared loaf. The Signoria prepares yet another ordinance, this one for a coordinated distribution of grain and a tighter schedule for market rotation. It is the sort of practical measure that could save lives or, if misapplied, widen the gap between rich and poor. How the city administers scarcity will decide more than immediate survival. It will set the terms for civic trust in the years to come. A lamplight guttering on the Arno throws a thin reflection. In a courtyard, a boy carves the initials of a father he will not remember. The next day, the Signoria will send messengers to each guild hall with the new market schedules, small instructions whose enforcement will test bonds of obligation and mercy across Florence's quarters. Dawn keeps its light low and patient. After months of fever and hurried graves, Florence begins to translate improvisation into habit. The city's public life, its markets, guild rituals, and civic ceremonies, does not simply return to what it was. It rearranges around absence and the practices invented to survive it. This is the slow, unglamorous work of recovery, a recalibration of obligations, of who cooks and who tills, of what a household can promise and what a city must require. In the days after the worst waves, families that remain begin the arithmetic of rebuilding. Apprenticeship records are corrected, the arte guilds convene formal sessions to ratify emergency statutes. Notaries file inventories that will be read for generations. The details are bureaucratic but consequential. A master who survives and has only one apprentice left must choose an heir, set wages, or sell his loom. Notarial acts fix those choices into enforceable reality. Women who have taken on shop management write accounts, bargain with grain merchants, and negotiate deliveries in ways that were once the province of male heads of household. These acts are quiet, practical, and decisive. Everyday sound returns in different registers. The clack of looms is softer, timetables staggered to conserve fuel and avoid crowding. Bakers bake in shifts, market days are scheduled by guild committees. The signoria's clerks, still pallid from long nights, keep lists of households prioritized for relief. Confraternities that once organized festivals now coordinate bread allotments and burial teams. The city learns to govern scarcity through small rituals, token ledgers, public registers, and the careful rotation of market stalls. Practical arrangements, who tends a loom, on which day, which street receives the weekly bread cart, becomes civic law and microcosm. Religious life, compressed into domestic space, also evolves into civic function. Parish priests tally names of the bereaved and pass lists to confraternities. Many churches repurpose funds to buy wood for coffins or to support midwives. Private devotion becomes a carrier for public memory. Small altarpieces commissioned for home chapels memorialize lost kin, and laments once sung in piazzas move into parlors. Clergy spend hours writing registers of orphans and widows, which confraternities then use to allocate assistance. This fusion of piety and administration will leave a visible mark on Florentine patronage. Intimate devotional commissions and domestic memorials proliferate where grand public pageants have waned. Markets and credit reknit, but do not return unchanged. A pattern of higher wages for skilled artisans takes hold in many trades because demand for labor outstrips supply. Journeymen bargain for immediate pay. Apprentices receive practical training on accelerated schedules. Some households capitalize on this shift. Survivors with capital invest in expanded production of essentials. Others, ruined by loss, sell property in fire sale auctions and fade from civic prominence. Notarial archives will later map these reallocations, but at the time they are hammered out in hushed rooms where scribes copy rapid wills and inventories into municipal chests. Municipal governance strides forward in practical fields that had previously relied on custom rather than regulation. City councils, pushed by necessity, develop ordinances about market rotation, designated burial grounds, and the use of vacant houses as infirmaries. These measures are uneven in enforcement, but represent a new civic toolkit. Over time, they seed ideas about public responsibility and the means governments may use to protect common welfare. Some proposals, staggered market days, supervised burial teams, modest stipends for guild-supported widows, work well enough to be repeated. Others falter under the strain of enforcement and the limits of resources. Social trust is fragile but resilient. Where suspicion once threatened violence, networks of guilds and confraternities rebuild mutual obligations through regulated charity and legal instruments. Guilds that provide stipends to widows and orphans help stabilize neighborhoods. Confraternities that keep burial lists and pay for coffins restore a measure of dignity to the dead. Yet the scars remain. Social exclusion hardens in pockets, and migrant or itinerant groups often find doors closed. The city's moral economy depends on these intermediary institutions. When they function, recovery is plausible. When they fray, disorder rises. Cultural responses proliferate. Storytellers and scribes compile household laments and local ballads. Painters accept commissions for small devotional panels that memorialize the dead in family chapels. Literary work, Boccaccio's Decameron among the most famous examples, will later use the plague as a frame to explore human behavior under stress, mixing satire, compassion, and ethical reflection. These artistic traces will shape how later Florentines remember the catastrophe, not only as a sequence of deaths, but as a reshaping of civic life, taste, and private devotion. Perhaps the most intimate change is in the domestic technologies of care. Midwives and experienced household managers teach neighbors how to prepare simple broths, fumigate rooms with aromatic smoke, and turn the fevered without exposing children. Household itineraries, who boils water, who sweeps, who prepares bedding, become codified practices passed across kinship lines. These technologies of day-to-day survival contribute as much to recovery as laws and ledgers do. They are the quiet infrastructure of survival. Yet hazards linger. Plague, as Florentines learned, does not always vanish on a fixed calendar. It returns in waves, testing the durability of new practices. The choice to move between city and contado remains fraught. Villas can shelter families temporarily, but also import risk to rural communities. Economic pressures push some to flout market schedules. Social resentment sometimes hardens into exclusionary practices that weaken civic solidarity. Recovery is always a negotiation between public policy and private necessity. In a small, decisive scene, a guild meeting adjourns with a compromise. Accelerated training, a modest wage increase for surviving journeymen, and a fund to support widows for 6 months. The notary files the agreement and copies it into municipal rolls. A widow pins a painted panel above her hearth and says aloud the name of her husband for the first time. A clerk at the Palazzo Vecchio scripts lists of neighborhoods for prioritized grain distribution. These modest acts, legal, ritual, and practical, accumulate and will determine whether Florence heals into a closely similar civic body or whether absence and reallocation create a new social architecture. At dusk, a messenger arrives at the Palazzo Vecchio with a new report. Scattered fevers have been noted on the river's other side, and the council faces a choice that will test the fragile bargains just made. Dawn in Florence, after the first brutal months, brings the slow work of reckoning. The city does not simply resume. It registers what happened and builds around absence. Families that kept hearths open write new accounts. Guilds that survived ratify emergency statutes. Churches count the orphans whose names will be carried forward in parish books. These administrative acts look bureaucratic, but they are the scaffolding of future life. The psychological landscape is as tangible as the legal one. Survivors wake to an altered city, the smell of boiled herbs clinging to doorways, the sight of fresh earth where a neighbor's garden used to be, the hesitant silence of children who no longer ask for stories their grandparents would have told. People replay small choices. Did I send bread yesterday? Did I seal that window? Did I answer that knock? Practical guilt becomes a social grammar. It shapes who will be trusted and who will be avoided. Artisanal practice continues, but its rhythm and purpose evolve. A carpenter who once specialized in fine furniture now makes coffins and repairs shutters. Painters take commissions for private panels that memorialize lost kin. Goldsmiths fashion simple reliquaries. Demand for modest, useful goods rises while ostentation recedes. In workshops, the chatter of apprentices carries a different seriousness. Tasks learned quickly, because the loom must not stop, and families await every coin. Memory politics takes shape in private and public registers. Chroniclers record dates and deaths. Boccaccio will later frame memory as storytelling used to endure absence. Families compose private liturgies, a candle at dusk, a bowl at the threshold, a whispered name repeated each morning. These domestic acts are both consolation and civic record, small practices that, strung together, form the city's living archive. Markets knit back together through law and improvisation. The seigneuria's ordinances, staggered market days, designated burial tracts, temporary requisitions, become a patchwork policy. Enforcement is uneven, but where followed, these measures reduce immediate danger and create space for commerce. Notarial records show both fire sale auctions that disperse property and consolidations by households that survive. Credit networks realign slowly and unpredictably. Merchants abroad wait to learn which partners remain solvent and able to ship goods. Religious life reorients toward care. Confraternities redirect funds from pageantry to bread and burial. Churches support midwives and apprentices. Spiritual explanations persist, but practical piety predominates. Caring for neighbors, feeding the hungry, recording names. Where priests are absent, lay people perform last rites with hands educated by loss. Where confraternities manage burials, ritual is abbreviated but sincere. Social bonds fray and then reform. Neighborhoods that lost many members close ranks and lean on surviving families for work and protection. Guilds that retain masters try to stabilize wages and admit outsiders to keep production functioning. Servants who survive sometimes gain leverage. A journeyman may demand immediate pay rather than deferred benefits. An experienced housekeeper may become the practical head of a household. These shifts do not overturn hierarchy overnight, but they create new practical authorities within households and neighborhoods. Health practices that emerge during the crisis become household knowledge. Aromatic fumigation, isolation of the sick where possible, careful removal of corpses, simple broths and cooling compresses. These domestic techniques are a quiet public health legacy, passed from midwife to neighbor. Midwives teach each other how to move a fevered body without coaxing contagion into a child's room. Such know-how keeps more than bodies alive. It preserves the rhythms of a neighborhood. Recovery is uneven and fragile. Waves of sickness recur and test provisional institutions. Rural areas absorb refugees, but sometimes at heavy cost. Monasteries and hospices petition the city for aid. Political tensions simmer. Those who profited by buying land cheaply or enforcing debts draw resentment. These resentments will feed larger conflicts in years to come, and the plague will be recalled as one element among many that pushed Florence toward labor disputes and political unrest. The aesthetic of memory changes. Private chapels and small memorial panels multiply. Storytellers compose laments that enter communal repertoire. When public pageantry resumes, it will be tempered by practical charity and municipal safeguards. The catastrophe leaves marks not only on ledgers and graves, but on how Florentines name the city, a place obliged to care for its poor, manage its markets, and record its dead. That afternoon, a group of surviving apprentices meets in a shaded courtyard off the Via del Corso. They sit on low benches around a basket of thread and a shared mug of watered wine. The air smells of oil and boiled rosemary. The muffled ring of a hammer marks the hour. Conversation begins with practical questions. Who can spare a day's labor? Who knows a spare chest of coals? Then hardens into planning. One suggests pooling small savings to pay a journeyman a steady wage. Another proposes a rotation so each family keeps a loom running while others fetch fuel. They test the plan that evening by keeping 2 looms running with 3 men each, trading hours and food. Fingers are clumsy at first, patterns imperfect, but the work holds. A master who passes pauses at the courtyard gate and watches. He does not stop them. The apprentices leave at dusk with the small exhilaration of people who have made a fragile bargain that may keep skills circulating and families fed. Inside the Palazzo Vecchio, the Signoria debates the next move. Councilors smell smoke from kitchen fires and read petitions piled on low tables, requests for grain, demands to close certain bridges, pleas for medics to be sent into outlying villages. The practical options are stark: reroute supplies to the contado and risk shortages within the city, or defend urban stores and let rural refugees starve. The balance between charity and order will again be tested, and the choices will have consequences for who eats and who goes hungry, for which villages survive, and for the Signoria's authority. As night falls, a messenger arrives with a worn parchment. Reports of renewed fever along the Arno's southern banks and a petition from contado villages requesting grain and medical help. The Signoria must decide whether to reroute supplies, close a bridge, or send physicians into the countryside. The choices will test the fragile bargains Florence has just forged, and the apprentices' experiment will face its first external pressure. Morning light arrives on Florence with a quiet, weary precision. The city that once kept time by guild feasts and public pageants now keeps time by inventories and small mercies. Where attention once spread outward toward patronage and display, it now concentrates on feeding households, fixing broken looms, and maintaining lists of the dead. Decisions that were once private, who will marry a widow, who will inherit a shop, have public consequences. At the Palazzo Vecchio, clerks copy registers of orphans. Confraternities coordinate coffin funds. Guilds sign emergency statutes to admit new hands and to promise stipends for widows. These acts are bureaucratic but consequential. A mother who relied on her husband's daily wage learns arithmetic and haggling in order to feed her children. A journeyman who once accepted deferred room and board now demands immediate payment to support his family. Workshops rearrange themselves. Looms are tended in shifts to save fuel and to reduce crowded benches. Masters teach apprentices in compressed sessions. A sequence is shown twice, then the pupil practices while the master watches from a measured distance. The air carries the bitter tang of dyes and the warm dust of wool. A young apprentice walks home at dusk with blistered fingers and a new sense of responsibility. His learning is practical and urgent. Women take on responsibilities that were often invisible before. Widows run shops and keep accounts. Daughters negotiate with grain sellers and arrange deliveries. Midwives extend their duties, guiding births one day and tending fevers the next. This is not an instant revolution in gender relations, so much as a rearrangement driven by necessity. Households need managers and the economy needs labor. When a widow decides to keep a loom running rather than sell it, she shapes not only her household's survival, but the texture of local production. Religious life changes in tone and function. Priests and confraternities transform devotional obligations into practical relief. Masses for the dead are accompanied by distributions of bread and by organized burial teams. Private altars proliferate as families memorialize lost kin at home. Painted panels and small carved crosses appear in parlors where previously only public chapels displayed such objects. Memory becomes intimate because municipal records are often incomplete. Neighbors preserve names through repeated prayer and domestic ritual. Not all shifts are benevolent. Economic pressure sometimes produces coercion. Creditors auction property to satisfy debts, and opportunistic buyers purchase houses at depressed prices. Families that survive illness can be dispossessed by the market's harsh arithmetic. These private losses create grievances that simmer in daily life. And those grievances, though private now, can feed larger political tensions later on. Practical public health practices enter household vocabularies. People fumigate rooms with rosemary and juniper smoke, isolate the fevered where possible, and reduce public gatherings. Midwives show neighbors how to apply cooling compresses. Apothecaries sell distilled vinegar and simple balms. Confraternities hand out ropes of rosemary and clear instructions. These measures are imperfect and cannot eliminate risk, but they reduce danger in measurable ways and create a shared body of practical knowledge that circulates by word of mouth. Economic recovery is uneven. Bakers, carpenters, and coopers find steady demand because daily life requires bread, shelter, and storage. Workshops devoted to luxury textiles and ceremonial goods languish until wealthier households reassemble their patronage. Because skilled hands are scarce, wages rise in particular trades. Journeymen use this leverage to press for immediate pay. Credit networks reknit slowly. Merchants abroad hold correspondence until they learn which Florentine houses remain solvent. Notarial records will later map these reallocations, but in the weeks after catastrophe, people make hard choices by lantern light. The signoria confronts stark trade-offs. Counselors must balance enforcement with mercy, restrict market hours to reduce crowding while ensuring enough grain for those who cannot store it, designate burial grounds beyond parish yards while preserving dignified rights. Legitimacy depends on outcomes. When guilds, confraternities, and neighborhood associations function well, they stabilize recovery. When those intermediaries fragment, disorder follows. Culture adapts and remembers. Storytelling migrates into private parlors. Songs and laments circulate from kitchen to courtyard. Painters accept commissions for small devotional panels rather than grand civic cycles. Boccaccio's later decision to frame storytelling as household solace echoes this shift. Narrative becomes a means to pass the night and to hold memory. Small devotional commissions, portraits of families, and carved grave markers multiply. These modest acts will gradually reshape Florentine taste and how the city commemorates loss. Tensions persist. Rumor and blame trace old social fault lines. Itinerant traders and the poorest often shoulder suspicion. Merchants from rival ports are eyed warily. Some neighborhoods tighten access and screen newcomers. Other quarters open their doors out of necessity, inviting neighbors to share bread and labor. The choice between exclusion and mutual aid is both moral and material, and it will determine which communities weather the crisis. Late one dusk, a circle of women in a small courtyard stitches a shroud while exchanging news about flour and spare beds. Nearby, a notary seals a hastily drawn will by lamplight. A guildmaster signs a small stipend for a widow. These acts, legal, domestic, devotional, move together like parts of a single mechanism. Survival as shared labor, municipal duty enacted through household practice. The immediate hinge of the moment is practical rather than spectacular. A mule arrives from the contado with a petition. A grain convoy has been delayed, and villages across the river plead for aid. The signoria must decide whether to release stores and risk local shortages in the city, or to conserve supplies and let rural households falter. That decision will reveal whether Florence can translate improvised charity into a durable public ethic, or whether scarcity will harden solidarity into narrower preservation. Dawn finds Florence tracing the consequences of choices made at the Palazzo Vecchio and in kitchen courtyards. The Signoria's decision to release a portion of the civic granary to the contado is a gamble. It shores up rural goodwill and helps stave off desperate flight back toward the city, but it also thins reserves and forces new rules at market squares. The decision is practical, a political act of shared risk, and its effects ripple quickly through workshops, parish rolls, and family conversations. In the days that follow, market rotation becomes law and practice. Guild clerks post lists, which streets may sell bread on which days, which trades rotate stall access, and which neighborhoods receive prioritized distributions. The list feels bureaucratic and intimate at once. It is read by mothers at breakfast and by journeymen at the guild hall. At dawn, bakers set aside loaves for households on the relief roll. Midwives carry small coins anonymously between doors. These routines conserve grain but also produce new frictions. Who qualifies for relief, who gets prioritized, and how to prevent corruption when hunger sharpens private calculation. The contado responds to the grain. Small villages that received aid hold back from sending families into the city, reducing one vector of contagion. Monasteries that received modest allotments free up hands to tend the sick locally, rather than ferrying them into Florence's overflowing hospitals. But the aid is not a cure-all. The countryside storehouses are thin. A bad season could erase the fragile buffer. Meanwhile, within Florence, the reduced stores push prices up in informal markets, creating tensions between those who can afford black market purchases and those who cannot. Among artisans and guilds, the new ordinances become a pressure point. Masters who had accepted the signoria's market schedules now find themselves negotiating over who may draw on the civic relief lists. Journeymen demand that some of the freed resources fund stipends for widows, rather than wealthy households with villas beyond the hills. Arguments that once played out in guild halls now spill into public squares and into notarized petitions. Notaries record these disputes with ink that will become a durable ledger of social stress. Petitions for charity, protests against opportunistic buyers, emergency statutes that will later be referenced as precedent. The apprentices' rotation experiment becomes a local model. Where boys and girls once apprenticed under a single master for years, several workshops institute shift-based learning. A pair learns warp and weft in the morning, another pair at dusk. The compressed technique produces errors and strained hands, but keeps looms moving. It also raises a practical question. If a journeyman dies, do apprentices inherit the right to continue the loom's work, or does the master's family sell it? These legal ambiguities push notaries into new territory as they draft temporary rules and guardianships to hold households together. Religious practice continues to adapt. Churches that once scheduled long daily masses now publish short prayer hours and coordinate with confraternities that hire additional lay volunteers to manage distribution lists and burial ledgers. A handful of pious patrons who survived begin to underwrite small communal funds explicitly to pay for coffins and midwives' fees. They ask that their names be entered into the parish book, not for vanity, but to ensure the fund survives them. Over time, such civic piety will become a model for organized charity. Small endowments that fund concrete relief rather than grand public spectacle. Cultural life, stories, songs, painted panels, remains a site of meaning-making. In evenings, household storytelling becomes a civic pedagogy. Elders recount how neighbors organized relief, how a midwife saved 3 children with nothing but boiled broth and steady hands, how a guildmaster paid a week's wages to a widow. These tales do more than memorialize. They teach practical techniques and social norms. A young apprentice hears such a story and learns not merely craft, but a moral script for reciprocity, which then informs choices at the loom and in the market. Tension does not vanish. Criminal opportunism, already an issue in the immediate crisis, mutates into economic exploitation. Buyers who eye houses for fire sale prices, creditors who press claims mercilessly, and informal traders who sell essentials at inflated rates. The signoria attempts to regulate prices and to limit exploitative auctions, but enforcement is imperfect and the law cannot resolve every private grievance. Grudges accumulate. A neighbor denied relief remembers. A wife whose dowry was seized nurses resentment, and these resentments are the quiet fuel of later unrest. Epidemiology, such as it was understood, begins to be written into civic practice. Even without modern germ theory, the accumulation of household knowledge, fumigation, isolation, early removal of corpses, and staggered markets reduces immediate risk when combined. Some confraternities begin to keep rudimentary registers: who fell sick, when, and where they were buried. These logs are clumsy, incomplete, and biased toward the literate and socially connected. Yet they are the first municipal attempts to make the invisible patterns of disease visible. Then a rumor reaches the signoria. A cloth merchant who fled to a villa has returned clandestinely and resumed trade without quarantine. The news spreads quickly. Journeymen fear that the merchant's disregard will undo their careful rotation. Widows worry that new arrivals will bring fresh fever. The signoria orders a limited inquiry. Local officers are to find the merchant and enforce a period of isolation or confiscate goods. Enforcement becomes a public test of the fragile bargains Florence has just made. Will civic authority hold when scarcity tempts individual advantage, or will private need outmaneuver communal health? The inquiry's result will matter not as abstract policy but in very practical terms. For who eats, who keeps a loom running, and who gets to bury a loved one with at least a token of dignity. The city holds its breath as small hands stitch shrouds and guild clerks cross names from relief rolls. A single enforcement decision will reveal which social actors have the leverage to protect neighborhoods and which must rely on improvised charity to survive the next wave of uncertainty. Morning after the inquiry, Florence feels enforcement as a test of civic resolve. The signoria's officers pace market arcs and inspect stalls. They question the cloth merchant about the manor he visited and whether he kept distance from his goods. Journeymen watch with narrowed eyes. Widows stand in shaded doorways, counting bread rations. The city's fragile bargains, market rotation, grain relief, accelerated apprenticeships, depend on obedience and oversight. Enforcement requires simple resources: men to watch stalls, clerks to cross names from relief lists, ink for ledgers, rope to mark market space. Municipal coffers, drained by burials and emergency stipends, strain under new demands. Councilors debate how to fund watchers: a small levy on exported cloth, voluntary donations from wealthy patrons, or reallocating burial funds. The choice tests whether Florence will tax its elite to preserve civic order or preserve elite wealth and risk unrest among the hungry. A telling scene unfolds near Santa Croce. A baker on the relief list arrives to find carts empty. The rumor is a well-connected merchant bought loaves to resell. The baker protests. A crowd gathers, hunger sharp in their eyes, the air hot with the metallic taste of worry. A guild-appointed watchman arrives and enforces the ordinance. He confiscates a crate for communal distribution. The act calms the crowd, but angers merchants who see civic power as arbitrary interference in trade. Voices rise. Curses and threats thrust at the watchman reverberate against pale stone. Elsewhere, market rotation falters under pressure. Buyers with coin bribe overseers. Watchmen accept gratuities. The signoria dispatches auditors, scribes who check rolls and test purchases, but their reach is limited. The result is patchy compliance. Some streets maintain fair distribution. Others become marketplaces where price and connection determine access. In those streets, the rhythm of giving collapses into the pragmatics of exchange and cooperation phrase. These frictions feed political debate within the Palazzo Vecchio. One faction presses for strict enforcement, public penalties, and the naming of profiteers. Another warns that heavy-handed measures will drive merchants to hide goods or flee, worsening shortages and damaging long-term trade networks. The compromise tends toward conditional restraint, fines when enforcement is possible, public shaming where evidence exists, and modest subsidies to dampen price spikes. This legal balancing act will shape civic expectations for years. At household level, cooperative experiments expand. Groups of families pool resources to keep looms running and share proceeds. The arrangement protects skills and distributes risk, but creates friction over profit sharing, succession, and legal authority. Who legally owns a loom when several families finance it? Notaries craft temporary co-ownership agreements. Masters haggle over whether apprentices can claim partial rights after a master's death. These micro-institutions test Florence's legal imagination and force scribes to invent forms they did not anticipate. Religious networks plug gaps where law cannot. Confraternities expand relief roles, negotiate informal credit with apothecaries, and underwrite midwives' stipends. A sisterhood agrees to pay a midwife monthly to ensure births are attended. An apothecary accepts a few bolts of cloth in exchange for distilled vinegar and herbal balms. These pacts weave civic, religious, and household obligations into a practical safety net, uneven, reliant on local patronage, but crucial when municipal resources fall short. Culture acts as judge and memory. Ballads and parlor tales praise watchmen who confiscate hoarded loaves and name merchants who profit from scarcity. Satire and gossip censure those who put coin before charity. Storytellers recast local disputes as moral exempla, generosity rewarded, hoarding punished. These narratives circulate in courtyards and tanneries, teaching children the names of those who shared and those who betrayed neighborly trust. Social memory encodes not only who died, but how survivors comported themselves under stress. The practical center remains the household. A widow who chairs a cooperative loom keeps meticulous accounts: who brought straw, who paid wood for the kiln, who tended a child while another worked a shuttle. Her ledger is a moral instrument deciding who eats. She is worker and arbiter. Her decisions can mean life for a child or forced sale of a chest of linens. Such choices are ordinary, minute, and decisive. They redraw social power in ways that formal councils cannot always see. The signoria receives fresh reports. The merchant's bales include cloth from ports where fever recently flared. He insists he fumigated the bales. Others say he broke quarantine to recover profits. Counselors weigh options: fine him, seize goods, or order household quarantine. Each option has costs. Fines mollify public anger, but leave bread in private hands. Seizure calms crowds, but risks alienating merchants whose trade the city needs. Quarantine protects, but requires resources to sustain isolated households. Counselors vote for quarantine measures, requisitioning a portion of the goods for immediate relief and imposing a fine publicly recorded in civic rolls. The decision draws cheers in market squares and curses in backrooms. For apprentices running looms by rotation, it signals that civic authorities can side with communal need. For merchants, it is a warning that private profit may be subordinated to public exigency in exceptional times. But the balance remains precarious. News arrives of a fresh fever wave in a riverside parish where rotation has been weakest. The signoria's seizure calmed some markets, but intensified suspicion in quarters fearful of arbitrary confiscation. The next move is urgent: reinforce quarantine and targeted aid in weak neighborhoods, or escalate seizures that could provoke merchant flight and further shortages. Florence stands at a hinge. Will fair enforcement, modest taxation of elites, and stronger guild confraternal coordination bind citizens together? Or will fear, hidden hoarding, and uneven enforcement fracture civic bonds into sealed islands of privilege and exclusion? The answer will be decided in coming days by clerks, watchmen, guild masters, and the widow who keeps the ledger, and its consequences will echo long after the fever breaks. Dawn is thin and pale as paper, and Florence wakes with the wary concentration of a city that has learned to measure risk. The signoria's ordinances have been tested, adjusted, and retested. Guilds have rewritten customs. Confraternities run burial teams and bread lists. Yet the human work of survival, the small, repeated choices made in courtyards and workshops, continues to decide outcomes more than any decree. Begin in a courtyard behind the workshop of a modest dyer. The yard smells of boiled larch and old oils. Buckets of indigo sit near a hearth where coals still glow from the night's heating. 3 women, an apprentice, a widow who now manages the shop, and a neighbor pressed into shift work, move with economy. One inspects a warp, another tends the vat, the third wipes a forearm with a strip of linen dipped in vinegar. Their conversations are short and practical. Who will fetch coal, whether the prossimo mercato will accept half bales, which neighbor needs a loaf left at his door. This small choreography is how production survives. Minute bargaining, mutual cover, the passing of practical knowledge that no ordinance can fully capture. Now, shift to a different rhythm. The signoria's clerks and auditors, hunched over ledgers in a cold room under the Palazzo Vecchio, mapping relief lists against tax records. Candlelight throws their hands' shadows long across parchment. They argue about allocations. Should a stipend go to an orphaned child whose father once paid guild dues, or to a widow whose house sits empty because her husband fled to a villa and never returned? The clerks possess inked authority but lack perfect information. Their mistakes can starve a family or divert aid to someone who already has land. Administrative choice becomes moral choice, and every line signed reverberates through an alley where a child waits for bread. Tension rises when two spheres collide: the practical, improvisatory networks of households and the imperfect machinery of civic enforcement. A group of journeymen implement a cooperative rota for looms across 3 nearby houses. They barter hours and grain. They keep a shared chest where proceeds are pooled. Then a notary arrives with an order from the signoria. New market slots will favor households recorded on the civic relief list. The coup's members realize that unless their shared ledger is recognized by municipal clerks, their access to grain will be curtailed. They send one of their number, a woman known for clear accounts, to the Palazzo Vecchio to petition for formal recognition. The petition scene is vivid. She walks through a city still flecked with peat smoke, past shuttered windows and a cart piled with wrapped bundles. Inside the council hall, the clerks look askance at a petition not in the name of a master or a guild. A clerk insists that only guild-backed cooperatives can be recorded. A counselor wonders whether recognizing such ad hoc co-ownership will encourage disorder. The woman speaks plainly about looms left idle and families hungry. She produces a small ledger with neat entries: hours, grain contributed, names of those who worked. The clerks whisper, peers frown. One senior counselor, recalling recent unrest over seizures and market hoarding, leans forward. The decision will test whether municipal law can adapt to practices born of necessity. Meanwhile, the city's moral economy is tested elsewhere by a violent but ordinary moment. On a narrow bridge by the Oltrarno, a merchant with connections refuses to hand over a batch of confiscated flour, claiming it as private property. A watchman appointed by the guild grasps the sack. The merchant's retinue pushes back. Voices rise. A scuffle threatens. People gather, wives carrying infants, apprentices with ink-stained fingers, old men leaning on staves. The watchman, sharp with exhaustion and civic duty, holds the sack. The merchant invokes property and trade. Those around him invoke hunger and the ordinance. A counselor's messenger arrives belatedly and reads an edict. In times of emergency, certain goods may be requisitioned for public relief with recorded compensation. The crowd's anger folds into tense compliance, but the merchant's resentment is a seed. Will he hide future shipments? Will others follow? That same day, a confraternities burial team pauses after unloading a cart of bodies by a newly dug trench beyond the walls. They have made a crude register, names where possible, the parish of origin, a token left with the wrapped bodies when kin cannot be present. A young brother, his nails black with peat, pins a scrap of wood into the ground with the name of a child whose mother died weeks earlier. The act is both grief and civic work, marking absence so memory might anchor to place. It is also an act of resistance to the erasure that mass burials make likely. Tension becomes policy when a fresh wave of fever ripples through a riverside parish where market rotation has been weakest. The seigneuriers debates options in a night session: enforce stricter quarantines and risk starvation in marginal quarters, or release grain and risk importing contagion to neighborhoods that thought themselves safe. Councilors weigh social consequences. Will the poor see the council as protector or predator? Will merchants who are squeezed pivot to clandestine trade? Will guilds cooperate or fracture? A compromise is proposed: targeted aid with enhanced enforcement, grant relief explicitly to named cooperative groups that can demonstrate equitable sharing, and subsidize watchmen drawn from confraternities who will be paid through a small levy on exported cloth. The plan is messy, legalistic, and subject to corruption, but it attempts to bind household improvisation into municipal structure. At the heart of the day is a quieter test of social imagination. The woman who petitioned the signoria returns with an answer. The council will recognize certain cooperatives provisionally if they accept an audit and a public bond guaranteeing fairness. Her relief is cautious. She knows that oversight could be punitive, but it also brings legal protection and access to grain. Back at the dyer's courtyard, the coup debates signing the bond. Some fear municipal entanglements, others see protection as necessary. They vote by candlelight. The choice is small and bureaucratic, but it will determine whether their looms hum next month. As dusk falls, Florence inhales and holds together through these interlocking experiments of law, charity, and household solidarity. The city is remaking itself in real time, adapting customs, inventing co-ownership forms, and testing the limits of civic power. Each decision, who gets a sack of grain, whether a cooperative is recognized, whether a merchant's goods are seized, rearranges the lines of obligation and survival. A single courier arrives at the Palazzo Vecchio with a new dispatch. Ships from the Mediterranean report delayed cargoes, and a divergent pattern of contagion in ports the city relies on. The Signoria must now reckon not only with local order, but with the fragility of supply chains that stretch across islands and seas, a vulnerability that could undo even the most carefully negotiated local bargains.